The subject of my talk today is American glassware in Australia, and importantly, how did it become so successful here? So the title is, How Did American Glassware Triumph Down Under? Just a little introduction and summary. I mean, at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, it's quite obvious from what we find here that early American pattern glass was sold in large numbers, large enough that if I was to walk out today into a thrift store or an op shop, I could guarantee you that I'll find pieces of EAPG pretty much in every shop I go to. They might not be great quality, they might be damaged, but it's pretty much prevalent everywhere here. It's very common. So in looking into it, it was sold in department stores and retail stores all across Australia, not just in the main cities. And it was sold in auctions, and it was even given away by trading stamp companies. So customer loyalty rewards. Back in the day, you would go to shop, you get coupons and you could trade those coupons for many things, and one of them was Australian glassware. So it was very common here. Now, a century later, it's pretty much forgotten about here. You find it everywhere. You can see it on eBay, you can see it on auctions, but it's almost always misidentified. It's always either categorized as English or just old depression glass, or usually as crown crystal Australian glassware. I think you'd say it's the awareness of it is very low. Okay, so one thing that I did notice as well while looking into it is that if you define EAPG as being produced from the 1850s through to about the 1915 period, there's almost a complete lack of any kind of pressed glassware from before the 1890s. You find a few designs from the 1880s, but it is almost all completely absent before that. There's a few hints and records in the newspapers, but it seems that very quickly around the 1880s into the 1890s, a demand for this glassware very quickly was established, and the market for it suddenly became available. And it seems that the EAPG suppliers were able to provide it into Australia very quickly, and also to an extent that pretty much flooded out the European manufacturers. You find much more EAPG here than you do from British producers such as Davidson or Sowerby, which at first I thought was surprising, because at the time Australia has those connections back to Britain. So you would kind of expect more British glass to be here, or more European glass, because it would have been coming from the ships from Britain, but you don't find that. You pretty much find the EAPG dominated the market here. So my interest as someone who looks at Australian history and Australian industry is, why was that the case? What happened with Australia that before the 1880s there was almost no pressed glassware? What happened that led to this sudden development? Okay, and I think there's a few different reasons for that, and I'll discuss them as we go ahead. Okay, but first of all, before we start, I think it's important to look at Australia's position from an Australian-centric point of view. Normally, when you look at a map from America or Britain, Australia is tucked off in a corner. It looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, and it essentially is. If you look at Australia here, when Australia was first settled through the 1800s, to get to Australia, you would have to come from ship all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, all the way to Australia. Now, this is a distance of about 14,000 miles, depending on where in Australia you're aiming for. And this was a months-long voyage. Okay, and similar to America, you have to cross the Pacific. It's a shorter distance. It's almost half the distance, but it's still a long, long way away. There's an expression that's used quite a lot here that comes up, especially in relation to business and the development of Australia, which is the tyranny of distance. Tyranny of distance is something that was really felt here in the 1800s. Australia was a remote place. It was a long way. It took months to get any kind of message, any kind of news anywhere in the world. To get the news or to receive it, to send a message, to receive it would take months. And I think this shows why even today, it's a long way. It's a long haul flight to get anywhere from Australia. It's hours and hours just to get out of the country into Indonesia, our closest neighbor. So why did Britain choose to settle Australia back in the day? Why did they choose somewhere so far away and so remote? And the answer, I'm afraid, is probably to do with the Americans, because before in the 1700s, Britain would send its surplus convicts, surplus population to America, either as settlers or as indentured laborers. Now, after the War of Independence, that option was cut off, and Britain had to look for a new place to send its convicts. And fortunately, around the 1770s, James Cook had explored the eastern coast of Australia, and he had mapped some potential sites that could be used, one of which was Botany Bay in New South Wales, which was roughly about here. So Britain, in the 1780s, decided to establish a new colony. So we'll get to this in a minute. The place they chose was Botany Bay. So in, I think it was 1788, 1787, they sent the first fleet, which is a fleet of ships, sailors, marines, and convicts to establish this new colony. And they arrived in Botany Bay in New South Wales in 1788, and they actually had quite a event-free journey. Most of the convicts, most of the settlers made it to Australia. Now, Botany Bay turned out not to be a great site, but luckily just a few miles north, there's something called Port Jackson Bay. And if you've ever seen modern Sydney, you know that it's built around this fabulous bay with the Opera House, the bridges. That's where the first fleet settled. So now you can sort of see the state of development in Sydney at the time. This is 1803, a painting by a guy called George Evans called Sydney from the West Side of the Cove. Just to give you an idea, I'm sure you've all seen the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney Opera House would be on this piece of land here. And this is now Central Quay in the centre of Sydney, where all the ferries travel to all the different parts of Sydney, and it's near the centre of the CBD. Okay, now I'm not going to go and spend a lot of time talking about the settlement of Australia, but this is a map of Australia showing the different colonies that were established and the dates of establishment of the cities. So we have Sydney was founded in 1788. Sydney itself actually is not in a great location. It's surrounded on all sides by very inhospitable terrain, namely the Blue Mountains. It was a long time before anybody had found or was able to plot and navigate a land route through the mountains. So they had to look for other areas to settle to expand the colonies. And the next one was actually in Launceston in the north of Hobart, in the north of Tasmania in 1804, followed by Hobart in 1805. You then have various different cities being established in Brisbane, Perth and Fremantle, and then you have Melbourne and Adelaide around the same time, and Darwin comes a lot later. Now, during this talk, it's important to remember that all these colonies were independent from each other. They were almost acting as different countries. So people from Victoria thought that they were from a different place from someone from, say, New South Wales. They had their own governments, they had their own import tariffs. They quite often acted very much in self-interest. So as we go through the story of Australian glassmaking and the prevalence of APG, it's important to remember that these are, until about 1901, when Australia federated, these were all different independent colonies. Okay, so if we look at now the history of glassmaking in Australia itself, in the very early days of the colony in Sydney, it was so far away from Europe that glassware would have been seen as a luxury. Okay, there were the first attempt that I'm aware of to establish a local glass industry is a funny little story that took place in 1812 when two convicts, a guy called Simeon Lord and another one called John Hutchinson, decided to start a glass making operation. And after I think about a year, they were able to finally produce a gross, which, oh, it's that 144 in Imperial. They were able to produce a gross of what they called perfect glasses. Unfortunately, nothing else ever came of this glass making venture. And it turns out that John Hutchinson was sent there as a convict for fraud and conning. He was a con man and fraudster. And it's probably a case that he overstated his interest in glassmaking and his experience to get either a lucrative business going or to get out of harder work. So he probably wasn't an expert glassmaker, and this was very much trial and error, I think, that they were doing. So after that early attempt in 1812, there were really no further attempts to make glass into like least from the 1830s to 1840s. Now, this picture I'm just going to show you here is it's an example that's held in the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences up in Sydney. And in 1832, I think an entrepreneur called James King, who had arrived in Sydney 5 years before, he was looking for industries to establish to earn a living. And I think he must have thought glassmaking might have been a possibility, because he arranged for a shipment of local Sydney glass to be sent all the way back to London, where it was made into a variety of different shapes, but the surviving ones are these jelly glasses. They were made at the Falcon Glassworks of Pellet and Company in London. These glasses were all shipped all the way back to Sydney, where they arrived in 1833. Now, John King, his name was, he was very excited. These fabulous glassware had been made. He was ready to show it to his fellow Sydneysiders. Glass can be made with our local sand, but in a twist of fate, as it happened, when this glassware arrived back, at the same time, several large cargoes of glassware from ships turned up. There was a glut of glassware onto the Sydney colony, and no one was interested in his glass. It was, they were all talking about the fabulous decanters that had come off a ship that just arrived. So completely disgruntled, he gave up on glassmaking and he went and established a pottery and I think wineries and vineyards. Became very successful. But this really is probably one of the earliest surviving examples of actual Australian glass made from Australian sand. It's taken from Marjorie Graham's book, Australian Glass of the 19th and 20th century. Now, after this, the glassmaking in Australia, if there was any, it's very small scale. There's not really a lot of information about it. But an event happened in 1851 that I think is fundamental for my talk and fundamental for the development of Australia, its industries, EAPG, and it was the gold rush. In 1851, this is, I believe, I might be wrong, but I think this is the first reported newspaper article about gold being discovered in Victoria. Not far away from Melbourne, gold was discovered in large quantities and it sparked a gold rush in Australia that really boosted population. I think before 1851, the population of Australia was about 430,000 people. Within 10 years of the gold rush, that had tripled to about 1.2 million. News of this traveled all over the world. People turned up from California, Canada, Britain, everywhere looking for gold. Now, I'm not going to talk about the gold rush now, we'll come back to it later. But in terms of glassmaking, 10 years after the gold rush in the 1860s, you start to see many more industries, small-scale manufactories being set up in all the capital cities. By the 1860s, you have lots of, like every city, Sydney and Melbourne would have had multiple facilities making mostly container glass, bottles, jars, things like that. These grow through the 1870s. They get slightly larger. Now, the most successful one, this is probably from the 1870s, is this Felton and Grimweir & Co. and their glassworks that have just enlarged the central point of this advertisement, which appeared in 1884 in the Australasia Sketcher. But it shows the industries established by Felton, Grimweir & Co., who were entrepreneurs. And I think, from what I remember, they first got started by making bottles for the pharmaceutical industry to hold medicines and tonics for people coming to look for gold. But within about 10-20 years, they've established several different industries: chemical works, bisulfite of carbon. The central feature is their glass works, the laboratory and something mills. My favorite one at the bottom here is the Leach Aquarium. They're providing all the leeches that you would need in Melbourne at the time. But this glassworks is important because there was the most successful bottle work and container glass factory in Australia. And eventually this glass factory would monopolize all glass making in Australia. It would become what was called Australian Glass Manufacturers. They made all the container glass, all the bottle glass, all the glassware. If you've ever heard of Australian Crown Crystal, they were a subdivision of the company that this glassworks would turn into. And I'm mentioning them now because when we get to the end of the EAPG story, this company and what it becomes, AGM, is kind of the nemesis of the American glassmakers. There is probably this company that that really killed off the American imports from their position of dominance, as we'll see later on, into something that just slowly fades out through the 1930s. And here is a rather grim lithograph of the inside of the Melbourne Glass Bottling Company, Beachhead, Emerald Hill, which is not far from where I live. And you can see the workers toiling away at the furnaces. It doesn't look like the most cheerful place to work, but I think it's an interesting thing to see what the. So this was from 1876. Now, come on to this feature, which is that the glassware industries within Australia, as the 1800s pass on, don't develop in their sophistication. They remain, if you look at what was being produced in America with all the beautiful pressed glass patterns, the glassware in Australia remains really relatively unsophisticated. They're relying on old technology. They're relying on glass blowers, mold blown designs. When you look at the glassware, it's very rudimentary. There's very few patterns. You get some beautiful engravings, but the actual glassware itself is not very sophisticated. And this is an article from 1911, which is, towards the end of the EAPG period, and it was published in the Daily Telegraph in Sydney. And it is, as you can see from the title, why does Sydney lag behind only bottles produced not yet in Australian industry? Now, there were bottle making industries that were successful. The one we've just seen in the previous slide, for example. As this is saying, in the general acceptance of the term, there's no glass making industry in New South Wales, none in Australia. And this is correct. In terms of pressed glass, I don't think any existed that was native made until about the late 1910s. 1918 probably was when it first started being made here, which is after what we would consider the EAPG period. So this article is lamenting why can't Australia develop an industry, and it talks about several different things. And one is, oops, sorry, as we go back, it talks about something here, which is probably £30,000, which I think there were $5 to $5 American dollars to the pound back at the time, would cover all the machinery used in connection with the industry in New South Wales. So they're saying that in New South Wales at the time, which was I believe the most populous state, the total value of all the equipment to make glassware and glass was only £30,000 or $150,000. Now, this figure of $150,000 is interesting because later we'll see that years before this, in 1 year, the National Glass Company would be sending that value of glass to Australia. So they're basically, when you read the whole article, they're just lamenting the lack of this industry. And they also have this disparaging phrase. So they're talking about various different companies here, the Sydney Glass Works, the Waterloo Glass Works. These are all small scale glass works. And they're also talking about a few places which quite disparagingly, they say there's a number of places which must be called factories because they are within the meaning of the Act, which is suggesting that in reality the writer is struggling to call them that. So this was the state of glassware in Australia when EAPG arrives in the 1890s. Hold on a second. We have got this, which is, I'll bring this up because this is an Australian-made jug, but it also highlights some of the problems of looking at the industry of Australian glass, looking at the history of Australian glass. This is from Marjorie Graham's book, Australian Glass of the 19th and early 20th century. This is an example of a mold-blown jug with applied handle from Sydney from the late, she says the last 25 years, sometime of the 1800s. Now, she describes it as very rudimentary, they're very badly made. The applied handle is wonky, there's been a break in the glass that's been fixed. She's not very impressed with it. And the other issue she has is it's very hard to actually identify anything definitively as Australian. Because so many imports were coming from abroad, it's very hard to say that something is 100% guaranteed to be made in Australia. I think she settles on this being Australian, but is not 100% sure. And I find that problem too, that the one quote in a book that I read that describes it quite well is that trying to understand the trying to find the history of Australian industry is like trying to study the Dark Ages in Europe. Nothing was recorded. There's almost no documentation left. But she is convinced that this is an Australian one. So this is what EAPG was up against. So why was the Australian glass industry slow to develop? Why was it unsophisticated? And I think there are probably three reasons. The first is that if you were a glass worker from Europe or America, you would not choose to migrate to Australia where there is no glass industry. You would have no work. Until the gold rush, you would have no reason to go to Australia. You would not move to Australia unless you were sent as a convict, because you just wouldn't find a living. So there was a real lack of skilled knowledge about glassmaking in Australia until about the 1850s. That changed in the gold rush because lots of people suddenly came to Australia from all sorts of different backgrounds to try and get rich. And as you look at the history of Australian glassmaking, you realize that the leading figures in the development of it came to Australia to look for gold, didn't get rich, and then went back to glassmaking. Okay, so firstly, there was a real lack of skill and knowledge about the industry. Second, if we look at the map, there were real problems with trade between the colonies and cities. If you were a successful glassmaker in, say, Melbourne, your market was very much limited to Melbourne and Victoria. If you wanted to sell in Sydney, you would have to, there were no railroads until late in the 1800s. The distances are huge. I mean, Australia is the size of the continental United States. The distance between the cities is large. And you would have to pay for the shipping. The shipping was dangerous. The coastline in Southern Australia is called the Shipwreck Coast. There are 600 or 700 wrecks just from the 1800s alone on the coastline. You'd have to pay for the insurance. And also, remember when I was talking about these are different colonies at the time, they had import tariffs on other colonies. If you wanted to import from Victoria into New South Wales, you would be charged the same import tariffs as goods coming from Britain or coming from America. You were treated as a foreign country. So if you were a glassworks in Melbourne and you wanted to expand into another part of Australia, you just couldn't compete in cost. You had the cost would just add up. You weren't producing a fantastically sophisticated product. It would be cheaper for people to buy it from a local producer. And this really carries on until Federation in 1901. It's only after 1901 that all these import tariffs between the states are reduced and companies are able to sort of expand their business into other parts of Australia. So this geographic distances and the separation of the colonies really inhibited the development of pretty much all industries as national industries across Australia. Okay, third reason, the third reason is the colonies and the tariffs. Okay. Towards the end of the 1900s, it did improve. Railway lines started to be developed to the borders. But the other issue with travel after the 1900s and the late 1800s was that the colonies all used different rail gauges. So if you wanted to send goods from Victoria to Sydney, you would have to stop, unload your train on the Victorian border, transfer it to a new train that had the Sydney rail gauges, and then it would continue its journey. Now, if you wanted to go to Perth, even once there was a transcontinental railroad, you had to change train twice to change gauges, which is just not an efficient way to do it. It's more expensive. And even now, that's a tiny bit of an issue. There's still places in Australia where you can find railway lines with 2 or 3 gauges on the tracks to allow the trains from different lines to travel about. So these were all reasons why that it was hard for companies to expand their business into other parts of Australia and develop. So I think in summary, you have the Australian glassmakers were quite unsophisticated, quite small based, underdeveloped, underinvested. They were quite isolated in their colonies. And into this market, EAPG is suddenly introduced. And why? So I think it's time to look at what happened in this period to make that so. Right, which brings us back to this here, which sort of brings us to here. Like, so when do we start seeing EAPG? This little advertisement is the first example of American pressed glassware that I can see in Australia, that I've been able to find in Australia. It's based on the Argus in Melbourne in 1854. Now, this is another one from the same year, which is from Sydney. But you can see it is a ship from the Queen of the Seas. John Cohen will sell by auction in his rooms, of flowing assortment of American glassware, and you have a whole range of different glassware coming in. Again in the year 1854, and there's some interesting details like the Jenny Lind syrup bottles, Jenny Lind meat plates. Jenny Lind was I believe a Swedish opera singer who had just done a tour of the US in the 1850s, early 1850s. So you can see some of this stuff coming through. It's important to note that this is 1854. This is 3 years after the start of the gold rush. Melbourne and Sydney are rapidly expanding. You begin to see these kind of auctions where people are beginning to supply the glassware to meet the demand of the growing population. Okay. Now I put this in for you Canadians. This is to show the effect of the gold rush. You have Australia and the gold regions, fast ship sailing from Boston, but it's from Niagara. CW, which I believe back in the day meant Canada West. So even Canada was, I mean, this is clearly advertising to people to come and search for gold. So the gold rush is an important event. Now, let me check where I am here. Okay, so what effect did the gold rush have? Okay, so one, it rapidly expanded the population. Okay. Secondly, and I think this is important to mention, the gold in Australia was very easy to find. It was found in huge quantities. It was found in New South Wales and in Victoria. And I think one of the main effects it had was that the average person coming to Australia, once they were released as a convict, or once they were, arrived, could literally grab a shovel, head off into the gold fields, and the gold was very easy to find. It's estimated that the average person, hardworking, could increase their income by 5 times by going to work in the gold fields. Historians have estimated that 10% of the people that went to work in the gold field made a fortune. Another 10% made enough to buy a farm or to develop a business. Rest, on average, did very well. Obviously, it was a lottery. Some people went to the gold fields and did very badly. But the finds that they could find were incredible. Like, it was between 1851 and 1871, Australia produced 1/3 of all the gold in the world. And it was this statement here by Geoffrey Blaney is important. It was saying the diggings were a casino, but the prizes went to the men of strength and stamina. The acclimatized colonial was more likely to find gold than a migrant fresh from England. And it was a great resource where the poor, accustomed to the hard work, could basically reap the rewards. What this meant was that very early in Australia's development, the population became quite wealthy comparatively compared to other countries very quickly. And it's important that this wealth was not concentrated into wealthy landowners. The wealth went out across the poor people almost. So you ended up within 20 years with a population that actually had a lot of income. They'd moved back from the goldfields into the cities. The cities were expanding very rapidly. And Australia very quickly went from, in the 1850s, a very frontier society, rudimentary buildings, almost no, very rough facilities, to a society that was much more sophisticated, developing fast, and was becoming more on par with America and Europe. And I think the tastes of the people changed because of that. So this here is the Welcome Stranger gold nugget, which was found a couple of hours away from here in Victoria. And it was dug up by 2 miners, John Deason and Richard Oates. You can see them here posing with their family. Now, this was found 2 inches under the ground. It produced 72 kilos of pure gold, which is worth about $4.5 million in today's money. So, and it was found just sitting under the surface. I remember when we looked at the map, they had this concept called the tyranny of distance. Australia was a long way away from anywhere else. Now, to send a message from Australia to anywhere took months. To get news took months. But in 1871, 20 years after the gold rush, Australia was connected to the global telegraph network. And this had an absolute, this is a life-changing event for people in Australia. The tyranny of distance was overcome. And you could send a message to London, you could send a message to New York within a day. You could get a reply back within a day. And the effect that had on business was Australia was suddenly connected to the business world. You could find stock prices, you could place orders, you could, communicate backwards and forwards to your suppliers, and it was a fundamental event. So the connection to the telegraph network came through Darwin, and then over the next few years it spread out across Australia until all the different cities were connected. Okay, so we'll move on from here. You begin to see, as the 1880s develop, more adverts. The sophistication of the adverts changes from auctions and through to, you begin to see more retail stores coming through. This is an example of Joseph Rosie's Universal Emporium in Ipswich in Queensland. This is like an example of a small regional store that's quite well documented. You can see a little lithograph of it over here. You can see that on the side it's clearly advertising glass. And these are a couple of examples of the adverts that Joseph Rosie's were printing at the time. So you have American glassware and lampware, some very nice articles of American manufacture being opened out, sugars, butters, glass dishes, crucifix candlesticks. So you begin to see a selection of the things that were being offered for sale. There's another one here from 1896, showing a similar thing. Now, about a year or two later, you begin to see advertisements coming through for Foy & Gibson and the department stores. Now, Foy & Gibson was probably the most successful department store in Melbourne at the time. It was the first department store to actually open interstate branches. And one of the things that's important about Foy & Gibson is that they produced these catalogues. They sold not just on their shop, but they gave out copies of these catalogues that were hundreds and hundreds of pages long and feature all sorts of different products. And it's from these that you can clearly see that the APG starts to be shown. So if we look at some examples from these catalogues, these are from 1906 and 1906-07. So winter in Australia here is obviously in the middle of the year, and summer covers the Christmas and New Year period. So in 1906 alone, you can see we have 4 different patterns that I can see here. You've got Panama, Spiral, Michigan, and Panama, I believe. So 4 being shown here. And then later in the year, at the end of the year, you have a completely different selection of glassware. What was that? Star and Bullseye, Bullseye and Fan, the States, I believe. And what is that one? One left. That is arched ovals. Okay, so in 1906 alone, you can see that 8 US glass patterns were being sold from just one retail company in Australia. You will notice that there are no European manufacturers here. And also, these are all coming from the United States Glass Company. There are no other manufacturers shown there. Okay, now, the dominance you see of US glass products in these catalogues is is also seen in the catalogues of the Sydney equivalent, Anthony Horden. And I think this is beginning to explain why so much US glass company EAPG is found in Australia compared to other suppliers. So we'll start with the United States Glass Company. Now, United States, this is from their 1904 catalogue, and you can see clearly that in Sydney, New South Wales, they have a showroom listed in the Commerce Building on Martin Lane. So when was this established? If we look at the newspaper records, this is an advert in the Daily Telegraph on the 7th of January 1902. And it is, I've enlarged the section, you can see the new phone connection, a new subscriber for the United States Glass Company on the 7th of January 1902. And I think this is probably when they opened their showroom. It's also this little advert here, which was in the Daily Telegraph slightly later that month, for a Lost Lady's Golden Watch, which to return to a JR, care of the US Glass Company, the Commerce Buildings, Ash Street. Now, this is in the center of the Central Business District in Sydney. And I think now it is actually the site of what's called the Sydney Recital Hall, where chamber music and orchestras play. Now, later in 1921, we can see this advert here, which has been received in Sydney of the death of Mr. Adalbert Roundy, who was until recently a resident of Mossman. It states here that he was the Australasian representative of the United States Glass Company for almost 20 years. Now, I think the 20 years would bring it back to about 1901. So I think that Mr. Roundy was sent over to set up the showroom and to establish their business here in Australia. Now, the JR here, his wife was actually called Juliet, and I think JR might be Juliet Roundy. I think it was his wife that lost the watch, is later advertised. Right, so how long did it last for? Now, this is an advert from 1917, which is talking about fire in the city. So the showroom here at the bottom, it says, only slight fire damage was done on the 3rd floor. The United States Glassware carried on its business. The stock, however, was damaged by water. So the showroom was still there. So it was there for 15 years and through to 1917. So when we look at the US Glass Company, what do we find here? Now, this is an updated list from the one that was shown in the news journal article. There are now 50 patterns of US glass found here in Melbourne. And you'll notice that the earliest one is Pineapple and Fan from 1895. And they go all the way through up to 1915. I think every year is covered except for 1914. But when I look, I don't know if many patterns were actually introduced that year. Now, this is already out of date. I've already found, just the last few days, found a Utah pattern, and one which I think is Bountiful Cornucopia. There's a bowl. So I think it's actually 52 patterns from US Glass Company. Now, I want you to look at the number of shapes, and you'll notice that for these, you quite often find multiple shapes. You're not just finding a single example, you're finding a multiple forms of these patterns. And they're common, and quite often I've found multiples of these. You know, they're not rare. I think in total, I've found now about 520 pieces of EAPG that are documented. Of those, only 80 haven't been from the US Glass Company. So 440 have been from the US Glass Company, which is about 85%. So about 85% of all the EAPG I found here comes from the US Glass Company. Now, it dwarfs the other American suppliers, but it also completely dwarfs the European suppliers. Like, I was expecting to find more Sowerby and Davidson, but their early Sowerby and Davidson are rare here. I get quite excited when I find them because it's normally EAPG. The same applies for like German and Czech manufacturers. You don't find anything before this 1895 date. Now, as we've seen, the office was there from 1917 to at least 1917. So although these were introduced in these years, I can't state that these are actually sold here in those years, because I'll come back to this later. This is an example of an advert from 1919, and it's showing that the US glass patterns are still being sold here in 1919. They're still selling Manhattan. There's the Michigan Swamp vases. That's, I believe, Athenia. So they were selling these products for a long period of time. So although these were introduced here, these patterns have introduction dates before 1901 and 1902 when the office appears. You can't say for sure that these were sold here at that time. Okay. Now, I think that one of the reasons you find, there's several reasons actually why you find so much US glass products. One is that they had almost a monopoly in all the product catalogs of the stores, the department stores. Also, they were selling in Australia for a very long period of time. And I think that means that they had more time in Australia to sell their products than some of the other companies might have had. So this is an example of some of the ones I've found. We have Newport, this beautiful little, I think, Panama Rose Bowl, Swan vases. Now, the Delaware Bowl is interesting because I only ever find clear glass. That's the only colored glass example out of 520 that I've found that has colored glass. The rest are all clear. We have Manhattan, we have the little Delaware in clear, sugar jar, Jersey. That's the Wyoming Cook cake stand. That was the first one that I found, so that still has a little soft spot in my heart. So you can see that it's quite an interesting selection. Now, goblets. These are interesting because I never find any EAPG goblets. This is the only set of goblets or glasses that I've found in this Sunshine, I believe that pattern is. So I don't know whether that's because these were used, so therefore thrown away or cracked or broken, or you know, the cake stands were fancier, so they're more likely to get passed down as heirlooms. But goblets seem to be quite rare, and cups seem to be quite rare. Some of the oddities that I found, I don't know if you remember these. These were, I displayed these in the Facebook group. These are, they appear to be pineapple and fan on the top sections. The base is very reminiscent of the, as you can see here, the Diana pattern. It came out later. They're currently listed as an unknown pattern, but I found several of these here. So they were sold here in a decent amount of numbers. I've probably found 5 in total, like 3 of the Comport and 2 of these. So they're unusual. I'm keeping them as part of my collection because I'm not sure what they are. But from what I remember in the discussion, the pineapple and fan was never made in these forms, or at least it doesn't appear in the catalogs in these forms. So they're possibly some sort of hybrid between the two. Now these are really interesting to me. They are what's that, bullseye and fan small comports, and I find these everywhere. I documented 20. Found these 20 times. I've got 10 of them sitting upstairs now in my shelf, and I've seen them in the shop much more since then, and these appear in numbers way beyond anything else. Like I don't know why that would be, because the pattern itself is not that common. I haven't found many other examples of it except for these small comports. They're between about 5 and 7 inches wide, depending on the state of folding. And the only reason I can think of this is perhaps at some point they were given away as a free sample, or they were a reward or a promotional item. But there are so many of them, and even the form of small comports, I don't see many other examples of this form around. So I just wonder if they weren't given away as a free item back in the day by a company to promote the sales. Okay, so we go through to, as before already seen, the company was still operating in 1919. So after 1919, well, this is technically beyond the EAPG era now, but you see adverts for US glass products continuing out in the 1920s. I think they were selling Black Satin and Queen Anne ranges. You see advertised in the 1920s, and also they applied for a trademark for the Queen Anne pattern in 1927. And I think this was because at the time the local Australian manufacturer Crown Crystal had made a copy of it, was selling it under the same name. So you see a record of the US Glass trying to protect the copyright. But toward the last record you ever hear of in the newspapers of the US Glass Company occurs in 1935. And it is when one of the representatives, Mr. Louis A. Scott, is appearing before the Australian tariff inquiry, arguing that tariffs against American glassware should not be high and that they should be lowered, because at that time, if you remember the glass slide with the glass company that I showed you based in Melbourne, it came on to monopolize all glassware, and it had founded the Crown Crystal Glass Company. So in the 1920s, Australian-made glass was being produced in Australia. The glass industry at that point then employed thousands of people, and the AGM, the Australian glass manufacturers, were able to argue for import tariffs, which I believe at the time were up to about 60%. So Mr. Scott from the US Glass Company was arguing that these were protecting a monopoly and that they were not good value for the Australian customer, because the Australian customer was now being charged twice as much for glassware because of the import tariffs. I don't think he was successful though, and we don't hear from the US Glass Company again. But in 1939, obviously Australia got pulled into the Second World War, and even within Australia, glass manufacturing was really cut back and curtailed. All the industry was switched over to military production. So I believe probably during the Second World War, there just wasn't the trade coming from America. So that's the last record we hear of the United States Glass Company. Now, if we look at other suppliers that we find here in Australia, you can see that probably the other two prolific ones, well, more prolific than the rest, but the National Glass Company companies, we found what, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 patterns from the various different companies. Now, some of these patterns were introduced before the formation of National Glass, so I can't tell whether they were introduced before or after, during the National Glass period, but so I've usually just grouped them together for my own purposes. So you can see the introduction years date from the 1895s. The National Glass Company didn't last for very long, so the last one is I believe Aztec in 1903. But the second manufacturer that is the most prolific here is the Imperial Glass Company. Now found 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 patterns ranging from 1904 through to Star and File, which 1918 is probably just slightly after the APG period. But again, if you look at the number of shapes in all these patterns, usually you're only finding each pattern once. Imperial Glass, you start to find multiples, but Imperial Glass, it can't find any record of it anywhere having a showroom here. There's no records in the newspapers or any kind of journal or magazine. So I don't think that they had a showroom here. They might have just been being imported by an importer. But they become more prolific in the 1920s because they were one of the probably larger imports of American carnival glass. Find a lot of Imperial carnival glass here. So they are probably the second most important company. My personal favorite is Cooperative Flint Glass. Sorry, my mouth's dry. The Cooperative Flint Glass Company. Now, I don't know why I get quite excited when I find these. I think everyone has their favorites. I quite like the Cooperative Flint Glass. Now, searching for records in the Cooperative Flint Glass Company is very difficult because there was a company in Sydney that had exactly the same name and it operated for about 50 years. So if you search for the Cooperative Flint Glass Company, you find thousands of references to the Australian one, and you have to I've gone through it and tried to look through it, but I haven't so far been able to find any reference to an actual showroom or an Australian-based location for them. But one of the things I found interesting about them is that their patterns, the years of introduction, they're quite early compared to the other manufacturers. You've got from 1888 Pearl, 1894s, 1896, 1898 Columbia. Then after 1900, you only find one example of Radiant from 1908. So I have a feeling that they might have been one of the earlier companies to either have been imported or to have made an effort to export their products to Australia. But again, they're rare. I've only found one example of each of these, but they do exist. After that, really, as you can see, you've just found quite a sporadic selection. Chippendale, obviously Chippendale from Jefferson is, you find the original Jefferson Chippendales here, they're marked with the crystal markings. You also find a flood of the later English Davidson Chippendales, but you do find, I have found an example of the actual American one. I found a wheat sheaf, Indiana, a couple from Fostoria. I found a lot of Fostoria from later in the 1900s, it appears, but during the EAPG period, just two here. Heisey, I found some here from 1897, 1899, and 1907, but in the advertisements of Foy and Gibson, after about 1920, they actually start to advertise Heisey glass after the AAG period, and it's unusual because they actually advertise it as Heisey's glass. Is it Heisey or Heisey? I'm never sure, but Heisey glass, they advertise it as marked with a diamond with the H as a symbol of quality. And it's one of the rare occasions where the actual manufacturer is mentioned in any of the advertisements or literature. So Heisey obviously got into Australia in the 1920s, a little bit later. But really, as you can see, not a lot of shapes from the other manufacturers. And also they're mostly from the 1900s, 1910. Nothing comes up from before 1888. Oh, and we also have this unknown one, I never know how to pronounce this, Scheherazade, from an unknown manufacturer. Whoever made it, they sent one over here to Australia too. Right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the National Glass Company again, because I'm going to bring up this little article, and it's a newspaper report, but it's quite interesting in that it's dated from 1901, and it's talking about a report from August the 31st of 1901 from the National Glass Company, where they're saying they're making substantial shipments of glassware, table glassware, pressed glass to several parts of the world. Orders are said to have been especially heavy from Australia and New Zealand, and they're talking about their contracts are for $150,000 from the National Glass Company alone in that year of 1901. But it's interesting later on because the way they talk about their competitors, American table glass is now stated to hold all but complete sway in Australia. The English and German competition rapidly becoming a dead letter. Okay, now the writer of the article takes a bit of offense to this. He thinks the writer's not well informed. In the aggregate, Australian imports of glassware are not a large amount, and of the total America supply is less than 1/3, which is probably true when you look at the import statistics for all the glassware imports. America doesn't sell the majority, but I think the National Glass Company are talking about pressed glass tableware, fancy decorative glassware, and in their opinion, they have blown the competition out of the water. And that's reflected here. I don't find much English glass. I don't find much Czech, German glass, and you just don't find it anywhere near the volumes that you find the APG. So I actually think the National Glass Company are correct. I think that the English and German competition really did become a dead letter during this period, and it's a few years before this, in 1899 and 1900, you find adverts for a coupon company called the Cooperative Coupons, who give out products as rewards for custom, and they advertise American pressed glassware, latest American pressed glassware, startling value, and they describe it as the only type of its kind available in Australia. Now, that seems to back up what the National Glass Company are saying here, that they have dominance in the market. Now, unfortunately for the National Glass Company, I think they go bust a few years after this, in what, 1903, 1904 maybe. So they also, become a dead letter, and the United States Glass Company take over. So we'll just have a little look at some examples. So here we have a few of the national glass patterns I've found. This is an interesting one because it's a cookie jar, and it is the only cookie jar of, I think the only largest jar that I've found here. I think it is the only cookie jar I've found here. The Ada pattern is one that I quite like. But this one, I think it's Delos, is engraved. And if I remember correctly, I think this is the only engraved piece of EAPG that I've found. And the engraving is also decorated with gold. So this is, that was quite an interesting one to find. So we look at Imperial, you can begin to see some of the Imperial glassware. They've got the Carnival, but I know it's not technically covered by the EAPG groups, but you can see some of their earlier Carnival glass designs. That's Propeller, and I think that's Shell and Sand. We have the diamond lace bowls, La Rochelle, you have the swung vases. I have this absolutely massive plate, which is about 12 or 13 inches across. It's the only one of its kind I've really seen here. And I believe that is Bel Air. Now, one of the things that did cross my mind about Imperial, about why maybe it's the most, after the US Glass Company, it's the most prolific one, is that I'm aware that there've been a lot of reissues of Imperial glass through the years where they've re-released a lot of these patterns, but I've never found any Imperial that has been marked with some of the symbols, the marks they put on the later reproductions or reissues. So I think it is, and judging by the wear in the base, the general feel of them, I believe that the Imperial ones are all from the original period during the APG period. I haven't found any, as far as I'm aware, I haven't found any reissues here. So I'm not sure if they made it over here. Okay, the cooperative flint is one of my, as I said before, favorite examples. The unique, this is that was an interesting kickstand. It's so solid, interesting to find, and it's in perfect condition. It's probably one of the best conditioned pieces of EAPG I've found. But I think this is actually the oldest pattern of EAPG by introduction date that I found here, which I believe is like 1888. Then you have the forest, celeries, the radiant. Now, one of the things I've noticed about EAPG is that whenever I find an example of glassware that has gold trim or any kind of staining or flashing, it is always EAPG. Never found any European glassware or any British glassware or any German glassware to have the staining. I don't know why that is, whether it was not carried out as often with those companies, but if I find a piece of glassware that's stained with trim, it is always EAPG. This is also an interesting one, the Royal, which maybe someone could answer this question later after the session. I found it in this kind of orange, yellow stain or flashing. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I wasn't sure if this is red that's worn off. Is this a worn off red, or was it actually made in this color? Because in places it looks like it might have been more red at one point. So if anyone knows the answer to that afterwards, feel free to let me know whether that was an original color. Now, probably my favorite find of all the EAPG is this, which I actually only found a couple of months ago. And it's two examples of Colorado and button arches. Now, from the 1907, I think it's Duncan and Miller button and arches. I believe this was made by Duncan's Sons, or one of the earlier Duncan companies. But in this period, I'm going to put it with Duncan and Miller. But they've been engraved with the first women's exhibition, 1907. And the reason I like these is because I've so rarely found any kind of engraved EAPG or glassware here. And this ties it very specifically to this exhibition that was held here in Melbourne in 1907, from between October 23rd to November the 30th. So we've got this little 5-week period where you kind of know that these were sold in that point, in that time. And it's a symbolic expedition because this was just before they gave women suffrage in Victoria. This was to celebrate that. So these are really celebrating women's suffrage in Victoria. So they were an interesting find. They're in perfect condition, and they have to be actually my favorite find from here. Okay, so in summary, nowadays, more than a century after the EAPG period, it is very easy to find EAPG here. You can find it in thrift shops, auctions, eBay. You can find it in quite large numbers. Now, the range you find is probably maybe not as exciting as you might find in America with all the different manufacturers, but you predominantly find pretty much the full offerings from the United States Glass Company and other suppliers. Now, awareness of it is increasing. You've noticed over the last 5 years that it's becoming more common for it to be identified as American now. 5 years ago, it wasn't so much, now it is. But the awareness of it is still very low. It's still all being thrown out. I think one of the issues here in Australia is that property prices are so high that when people pass away, they're passing on their property, but people aren't necessarily looking at what they own. And I think these are just not appreciated, thrown away. So there are plenty of opportunities in Australia to go out to and find a wide range of EAPG. And I'm sure there are much more to be discovered. I've only really been looking at this for 3 years. I got thwarted by COVID for 2 years. So maybe earlier EAPG does exist. I know that there's an advert from 1874 that describes American pressed glass in the purest white. Brad is a good one from the EAPG Society. He posted something, an article that showed that Atterbury were exporting to Australia in, I think, 1874. So there are older versions of EAPG out there, older patterns, but I think they're just in numbers that were small and that they're vanishing. They're very hard to find because they're not showing up, not just in the op shops and thrift shops, but you don't see them in auctions either. I look through, auction sites in Melbourne, and you don't see a lot of fancy or old EAPG coming through. So I genuinely believe that before the 1880s, EAPG was sold in small numbers here. And as the society became more sophisticated, communication with the outside world got better, and the population became more sophisticated and wealthy, that the demand grew, and the EAPG manufacturers were able to step in very quickly to fulfill that demand in Australia. And of them, the US Glass Company, which is not surprising because they probably were the biggest glass company at the time, they were the ones that most able to take advantage of that demand, rapidly established their showroom, and really dwarfed the market, flooded the market, and dominated the market for 20 years until at least the 1920s. So thank you for listening.